Did you know Japan holds a unique record with a homeless population rate of less than 0%? But how is that possible considering it's one of the most populous countries in the world? Just take a look at the United States, for instance, which is experiencing a major homelessness crisis with the number of people living on the street rising every year. Now, you might be thinking Japan has found the solution to one of society's biggest problems. But if you look past the headlines, the situation starts to look very different. The reality behind this seemingly amazing success story reveals a disturbing, dark reality about what life in Japanese society is like, and what is going on under the surface. So, how did Japan manage to have a 0% homelessness rate, and why is it not good news for the country? Today, we look at the dark side behind Japan's 0% homelessness rate. Stick around as we look at why there are so few homeless people in Japan. According to official statistics, Japan is a country with over 125 million residents. However, it only has around 3,000 homeless people, which is about 0.003% of its population. This is way less than any other countries with low homelessness rates like Switzerland with 0.02, and miles ahead of countries like the US where more than 500,000 people experienced homelessness last year. But why exactly? Well, there are several reasons for this extremely low rate. First of all, being homeless is very difficult in Japan, and in Japanese culture, it's incredibly stigmatized. According to a founder of a non-profit organization that's supporting the homeless in Japan, there is no culture of compassion for homeless people in the country, and they're usually seen as people who only have themselves to blame for their situation, and who deserve no help at all. This is even stronger because the majority of homeless in Japan are men, who are traditionally expected to be self-reliant, and their failure to do so is seen as an embarrassment, both by the public and by themselves. Authorities too tend to make it harder to be homeless than in most countries. Any kind of begging in public is banned by law, and homeless people tend to be pushed out of sight. Cities like Tokyo are known for implementing what's been called anti-homeless or hostile architecture, like parks that are locked at night so that people can't sleep there, or benches and other city features that are specifically designed to make lying, sleeping, and prolonged sitting on them uncomfortable in order to discourage homeless people from staying in the area. These policies contribute to the low rate of homelessness as it is something most people try to avoid at all costs. Japan also has some unique policies, which, while not designed to reduce homelessness, help to do it anyway. Japan has very strict laws on basically any drugs other than alcohol, and very severe punishment. As a result, just 1.6% of the Japanese population tried drugs other than alcohol in their lifetime, compared to 46% of Americans, which means that drug addiction in Japan is barely an issue. According to Tom Gill, a Japan-based social anthropologist, this is another key factor. At the same time, Japan has a very robust healthcare system, which is also significant since 30 to 35% of people who experience homelessness in the United States have a mental illness. Meanwhile, in Japan, people with severe mental illnesses tend to be placed in mental health institutions. In the United States, they often end up on the street. Finally, Japan has relatively accessible housing because it builds more houses than any other developed democratic country. This is unlike most Western countries where housing became increasingly difficult due to various regulations. Japan took the opposite route, and it has very few restrictions, making it very easy to build anything and making it relatively affordable. That all sounds great, and on the surface, Japan can be an example of a country that basically managed to solve a major social issue. Except that's not really true. Despite the official numbers, the reality is a lot more grim, and there are many more people without a home in Japan, but they're hidden away from sight and government statistics. But how is that possible? In the 1990s, Japan experienced a severe economic crisis when the stock market and real estate markets collapsed. In the following years, it became extremely difficult to secure a steady job with decent pay, and so millions of people were left to survive on low-paying, temporary part-time jobs. Many of them never managed to recover, and they became known as Japan's lost generation. These are people with no status and no place in Japanese society and no future. As a result, many of them were not able to hold down an apartment and pay rent every month, even in a relatively affordable Japan. But at the same time, they would do anything to avoid living on the streets in order to avoid the shame and stigma of society that comes with it. With this, the phenomenon of cyber homeless emerged. Japan has a wide network of 24-hour internet and manga cafes, where people pay by the hour and can stay as long as they want since the 1990s. Many members of Japan's lost generation have begun using them as temporary shelters. They don't have beds, and people often sleep in computer cubicles. Over time, the cafes expanded their services to offer food, drinks, fresh underwear, and showers. Gradually, this became an industry in itself. Today, cyber cafes are a uniquely Japanese concept of commercial homeless shelters. Ones that you have to pay for yourself. These cyber cafes are not by any means cheap. Prices for an overnight stay in a small booth cost between $17 to $28. The net cafe refugees, as they are known in Japan, often have some kind of low-paying, part-time, or temporary job that doesn't pay enough to rent an apartment, but they can afford to pay for a few hours in an internet cafe every night. These net cafe refugees are homeless. They don't have a home or a permanent address, and they're excluded from many aspects of life, but they don't look like it. They don't sleep outside, they work, and they do everything they can to maintain a clean-shaven, well-kept appearance to avoid the shame that comes with being homeless in Japan. That's why the government statistics on homeless people in Japan are considered wildly underestimated. Non-government organizations estimate that the real number of people living on the streets in Japan is at least 3 times higher than the government says, and that's even without taking into account the cyber homeless people staying in internet cafes on most nights, for at least a few hours. If they would be included, the real number would be radically different. In 2020, it was estimated that at least 15,000 people lived in cyber cafes in Tokyo alone, 5 times as many as the official number of homeless people in the entirety of Japan. Now, in one way, this phenomenon of cyber homelessness can be seen as positive. On one hand, it helps people to avoid falling to the very bottom of society and allows them to keep some level of dignity even though they don't have a home. But at the same time, the existence of the net cafe refugees demonstrates the incredible problems that Japanese society has as a whole. 1/3 of the entire Japanese workforce, or over 22 million people, are part-time or temporary workers. Not by choice, but because they can't get a regular full-time job. Not all of them are homeless, but most of them are only paid a minimum wage. They struggle to afford a rented home, and they have no prospects of their economic situation ever getting much better. Therefore, even though Japan's official homelessness rate is much lower than in the US, the percentage of people living in poverty is actually higher in Japan than in the States. And while only a few end up on the street, many more end up on the fringes of society, stuck living in cyber cafes and capsule hotels, and in a never-ending cycle of not being able to get a proper job to get a proper apartment, and not being able to get an apartment to get a proper job. And because of societal pressure, they prefer to remain invisible, and society prefers it as well. A problem that stays out of sight is a problem that can be easily ignored, and the government can continue to claim a 0% homelessness rate. Unfortunately, underneath it is a symbol of all the things that went wrong with the Japanese economy, and a problem that's here to stay as the number of the invisible homeless is only about to grow. So, that's it for this video. I hope you found something useful from it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.